want to start with a question just about the broader context of the Russian invasion. Obviously, Putin's invasion of Ukraine is an act of Russian aggression, and I think we on the left should, and for the most part, do oppose it. But it also seems like since the invasion began, the I guess liberal interventionist foreign policy machine has kind of been going into overdrive. And what I mean by that is we now see, basically every political leader and commentator in centrist commentator sort of trying to cast any and all criticism of NATO as nothing more than pro-Putin propaganda. So I think the question for you just to start is how do we understand the Ukraine invasion in a larger geopolitical context, but obviously without making excuses for Putin?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very important to emphasize that there's simply no excusing or justifying or providing excuses for um, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, even insofar as the um, the Russian state can sort of complain that its own preferred sphere of influence is somehow being or has been interfered with in the sense that in the sense that there's been calls for Ukraine to be involved in NATO or so on. And in that limited sense, one could point to Western hypocrisy in the sense that the US has its own claim to be a world policeman and so on.
Mhm.
Obviously, from the perspective of socialists and the left, there's nothing to be said in defense of the idea of spheres of influence. So I think, and of course, the human impact of the war is absolutely appalling, as are the
Mhm.
specific military crimes like the bombing of the maternity hospital in Mariupol. I mean, I think the problem is that at a certain, if we're talking about the immediate triggers for the invasion, then I think you can't really chalk that up to some sort of Western provocation or something. I
Mhm.
don't buy that. I mean, in a very general and abstract sense, I mean, of course, there's something of a contest and opposition we're seeing in sort of mainstream media now between sort of liberal internationalists who basically do want to use this conflict, use the Russian invasion to call for a sort of reinvigorated West, to call for more military spending, a strengthening of NATO, and this kind of thing. And then the currently sort of more defeated side, who are like conservative imperial realists like John Mearsheimer, who basically call for a kind of understanding of Russia's defense concerns and this kind of thing. And their position looks bad and difficult to defend at the moment. So, I mean, I think it's definitely the case that um, a lot of Western governments and a lot of countries not currently in NATO will be joining in a sort of campaign to use this war to argue for a stronger NATO
Mhm.
and stronger Western military spending. Although, of course, it should also be said that despite the claimed aims of Putin's war effort to so-called denazification or demilitarization of Ukraine, his actions completely play into their hands, and it's not hard to see why those arguments um, for a stronger NATO are going to be harder for the left to resist.
Mhm.
And indeed, we're also seeing not only do the argument become more difficult, but actually, like in parties like the Labour Party in Britain, there's a kind of clampdown uh, on those who dissent
Yeah.
against that kind of line against that. So I think it's a difficult position for the left because indeed we don't want to be seen to be in any way excusing Putin's actions or its kind of logic, but at the same time there will be this kind of pressure to join in a bandwagon uh, for things like for example, I live in Berlin in Germany, and currently the Social Democrat-led government has announced 100 billion euro
Right.
defense budget, which of course isn't actually going to help Ukraine or really solve that situation, but forms part of the need to be seen to do something.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to pause on this kind of question of the need to do something or what it is that we should be doing, right? Because as the invasion kind of goes on, there's really no clear end or resolution in sight yet, and we also now have a pretty serious refugee crisis mounting. And in response to that, it seems like a lot of politicians and commentators are now calling for the West to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Why is this not the best idea?
Well, the idea of a no-fly zone is senseless because it's just a euphemism for a declaration of war on Russia. It's not just like putting something in the sky to stop the planes going. Or, some people
Mhm.
think, oh, it's something like, oh, we're going to like use, we're going to like jam and the radar or something. No, I mean, like, no, it means shooting down Russian planes.
Right.
And so while the idea of no-fly zone um, gained ground in wars like in Yugoslavia and Libya and so on, and some culture in the Syrian case, that was with regard to states which are just immensely weaker than Russia is, and I think of course, one could say that if Russia in turn escalated in reply, then that would be their fault, not ours. But it's really not worth having the moral high ground if we're in a nuclear exchange in which
Mhm.
we'd all or large, very many millions of us would be killed. I mean, I think one thing I'd say about the no-fly zone discussion is a lot of the people calling for it or calling for a debate around it know that it won't happen,
Hmm.
so are using the discussion in order to strike a sort of tough posture. So if you look at people like, say, the Labour leader in Britain, Keir Starmer, who said it should be discussed,
Mhm.
or the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and indeed, of course, even Volodymyr Zelensky, I think, is
Yeah.
calling for a no-fly zone. But I find it, of course, in a certain light, for Ukraine to win the war militarily, it makes sense to try and internationalize the conflict. But I would suspect that the reason for calling for the no-fly zone is that it just generally serves as pressure for the West to give Ukraine more help. But certainly, it's a very bad idea, and I think its currency kind of reflects the idea that a lot of people in the West think that there's a terrible crimes and disasters going on in the world, and we can stop it. We can
Right.
press a button and make it stop, and that is not true. And indeed, I think we need to understand as well, it in a world of this conflict partly represents a sort of decline of Russia, certainly in its sort of near backyard, but also in a certain sense a decline of that kind of unipolar, the United States as leader of the world kind of thing. And I think we're going to see more conflicts of this type as other powers, also India and China and so on, become relatively more significant. And indeed, we can't just. It might sound good to press the stop button, but it's something we really can't do.
Right. So, going now to what kinds of solutions might be more productive. You had a great discussion in Jacobin recently with the Ukrainian scholar Alexander Kravchuk, and it's about Ukraine's outstanding public debt. And both of you sort of argue that canceling that debt would be a good way to help Ukraine right now. Over the last few weeks, we've heard a lot of talk about like how can we help Ukraine, and we actually had Branko Marcetic on the show last week to talk about some other solutions. But this was the first I heard of, this idea to cancel Ukraine's debt. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that would help?
Yeah, I mean, even in the conflict that's been going on since 2014, the Ukrainian state has resorted to ever larger borrowing from the European Commission, the World Bank, and the IMF. And its public debt is now so high that even before the fighting started a couple of weeks ago, or the invasion happened a couple of weeks ago, Ukraine was spending over 8% of its state budget on servicing debt. So even before this invasion, um, it was spending an inordinate amount on its debt interest and so on. But also, these debts were conditional on structural reforms, reducing the pensions bill, cutting back the welfare state, making a better business environment, and so on. So what Alexander Kravchuk talks about in the interview, he's a Ukrainian economist, is really that if we want to help Ukraine, then we should be cancelling the debt, and the aid offered by other countries should be unconditional, and whatever international funding there is to help rebuild the Ukrainian economy, that should be something that Ukrainians themselves control. Of course, that won't save Ukraine now, but it's important also if we think of this not just as like a conflict that is going on for weeks and months, but in the longer term. I mean, I should say as well, it's also important when we think, say Josep Borrell of the European Commission has, he predicted that there could be as many as 5 million refugees from the Ukraine conflict. And it's very important as well that our response is based on providing, proper living conditions, proper rights, proper immigration status, and so on for those people fleeing the conflict. Of course, it's true that in other recent wars that hasn't been provided. I don't think that's a reason for the left to not take that demand up now, just to point to hypocrisy. I mean, and also, of course, there are countries. I mean, I'm British, and Britain isn't taking Ukrainian refugees, or has only taken 50 so far.
Right. All right. Well, David, I want to again shout out Jacobin's coverage of the Ukraine situation. All of you should check out the articles that David has been writing and also commissioning for the site on this topic. Again, David Broder, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.